Okay, hi everyone, and welcome back to our second part of this session for the second panel. Thanks for everyone for staying online. This is a webinar on the impacts of active transport, a multidisciplinary research and practice field. My name's Haneen Kreis, and I'm from Texas A&M University, the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. I'll be chairing this session and making sure we're on time. I'd like to start by thanking James for chairing the previous panel and the four speakers, Rolf, Susan, Kelly, and Neil. We have four more presentations coming up, and I think they'd fit very well with the previous panel. And we'll hear from, first of all, Thomas Gucci from the University of Oregon. He'll be talking about the HEAT tool from the World Health Organization and how this can be adopted for a global audience. Then we'll hear from Rachel Aldred from the University of Westminster. She'll be talking about the propensity to cycle tool, methods for modeling cycling potential for research policy. We'll then hear from Stefan Gusling from Lund University, and he'll talk about why and how cost-benefit analysis can inspire transportation policies. And finally, we'll hear from Veronica Sanchez from the Barcelona City Council, and she'll be talking about a new model for sustainable mobility and how public spaces can change the way we move. So just like the previous session, you can submit your questions by the question and answer function over your Zoom platform, and I'll be facilitating those. We'll have 15 minutes for each presentation and then 5 minutes for questions and answers after each one. Towards the end, we'll have a bit more time for more questions and further discussions. And we can start now with Thomas. Welcome, Thomas.
Hi, Haneen. And I will share my screen. Okay, thank you very much for having me. I'm a researcher at the University of Oregon, and for the past 10 years or so, I've been working at the University of Zurich and collaborating with WHO on the health economic assessment tool for walking and cycling. Today, I'll be mainly talking about the tool in general, and then a little bit about this most recent development where we've developed a prototype for ISGlobal, as we call it, for the global context. I have to find a way how to advance my slides. So what is HEAT? It's a simple tool to allow consideration of health in planning decisions that affect walking and cycling. It is an online calculator available under this link that you see here. And it's specifically developed for a broad audience that does not have to have any expertise in health issues. It was originally developed for the region of Europe. And now, as I said, we have this global prototype, ISGlobal. After hearing the earlier talks today, I moved this slide up. I think it makes sense to put HEAT and these various tools a little bit into context. So if you think of this field of active transportation and health and how we can promote health through active transportation, we can think of maybe three different bins here. And you see in blue the factors that explain why people travel by active modes or maybe why not. And some of these factors are fixed and others are modifiable. And of course, a main interest in policy decision making is how can we modify the relevant factors so we can get people to walk and bike more. But the key question to motivate this, of course, is how much is it worth for society or for individuals to travel more actively? And this is where heat comes into play. So really the purpose of heat is to tackle this right part of the framework here. If you have either data or a model or just a rough idea of the left side of this diagram here, then you can input this information into heat, and it will calculate health impacts for you, and it will also monetize these impacts, and these outputs can then be used to feed into the policy decision-making discourse. The question that he asks and answers is, if X people walk or bike an amount of Y on most days or regularly, what are the health impacts in terms of mortality and their economic value? And this is expressed for the pathways of physical activity, the exposure to air pollution during walking and cycling, and the risk of traffic crashes related to these modes. In addition, heat will also calculate the effects on carbon emissions from shifts from motorized to active modes. Heat follows some key principles. Most importantly, it tries to absorb the most recent scientific evidence through regular consensus meetings and expert consultation. And then it really puts an emphasis on the user friendliness. The usability of the tool is a key principle. A lot of effort is put into keeping it simple, in minimizing the data requirements, lowering this hurdle for people to pick up this idea of health impact assessment. So I think this is the main contrast to the models and tools that we've heard about earlier today. It is a collaborative project. Heat's been around for over 10 years, and it's involved a large number of members of a core group that works on the tool, but then a lot of outside experts that have been pulled in for various topics being addressed. It's been funded through a large number of different agencies, and it involves experts from multiple disciplines. A little bit on the basic methodology. Heat applies a comparative risk assessment approach. So basically, we're comparing one case, which we call the reference case, to a comparison case. In other contexts, you might call these scenario 1 versus scenario 2, or a baseline versus alternative. But it's basically, we're looking at active travel levels in one case and a different level in a comparison case, and calculate how this translates into health impact and carbon emissions. A few comments on the calculations or the methodology applied. This is an aggregated model, population level model. So as similar to the ITHIM model, as Neil pointed out, we're not modeling individuals, or actually we're really looking at a high level of aggregation, just the population. Heat only calculates mortality effects, so we don't look at morbidity, and it applies simple linear dose response functions. They're listed here for physical activity, also see for air pollution, the relative risk. And for crash risk, we apply fatality rates per 100 million kilometers traveled by a particular mode, walking or cycling. Age is only considered in very crude categories. Either you calculate the impacts for all adults, or you can choose to calculate them for younger adults or older adults. There's a little bit of tweaking in terms of lags for uptake of active travel and build-up of health effects. The monetization is done with value of statistical life. The typical use case is what we call a two-case assessment. So you specify data for both the reference case and the comparison case. And this diagram illustrates how this would look like. In the upper graph, you see how the levels of active travel might be. Then you specify an assessment time. So you might want to assess impact over 10 years. And then in the bottom graph, you see the impacts, how they're quantified. So the difference between comparison case and reference case, considering a certain uptake time for these impacts or for the active travel. So the basic workflow of the tool is as shown in this graph, and the upper three boxes is really where the user's input is required. So in the first section, you will specify what you are assessing, which country, at what level, whether it's city level or country level, which modes you're interested in, which pathways, etc. Then you provide your actual data, that is data on active travel and data on the population that you're looking at. And then it gives you a number of options to adjust these data, which is sometimes necessary to obtain a more accurate assessment. Then he calculates the impacts through these four main pathways: physical activity, air pollution risk, and this is air pollution risk in active travelers, so pedestrians or cyclists being exposed to air pollution. Then crash risks and carbon emissions, and in addition to the actual impact, it monetizes these. Just to give you a little bit of a feel for how the tool looks like, here two screenshots from the user interface. It is also an R-based model that uses Shiny interface, Shiny web interface. And you can see it's basically like a familiar feeling of like an online survey or online tool where you click through, enter some numbers, etc. But you don't need to deal with any spreadsheets or upload any major data sets or anything like that. In terms of the active travel data that you enter, we try to accommodate the most common data sources and formats for which active travel data is available. And based on your choices, you will be prompted to enter more detail or the relevant details and sometimes assumptions. As you can see here as well, you don't necessarily have to have observational data, model data for that. You can also run this on a purely hypothetical scenario. So over the past several months, we've developed a prototype for ITHIGlobal. Originally, HEAT was only developed for the European region. And the main difference is really that the background data that the tool uses is not as readily available in the global context. So basically, we've moved some of these background data features into the section where user input is required. Whenever we have data available, the tool will still populate these pages, but users have more options to provide this background data at this point. So the specific features are obviously you'll have all the countries and the most important cities in the drop-down menu now. For population data, we actually do pre-populate this now wherever possible. And in addition, we help users to calculate the appropriate population size based on the age range that is used for the calculation. Mortality rates, we offer users to choose between 3 or 4 types of mortality rates, which exclude certain causes of death. By default, these calculations have been done using all-cause mortality. but you can now also choose to exclude injuries or infectious diseases, which obviously are not associated with the health effects of physical activity. Then users can provide their own air pollution estimates. They can calculate their own crash rates, which is a type of data that is typically not readily available. And they can also calculate their own value of statistical life. Here is an example how a result looks like that comes out of the HEAT tool. This is an assessment of the New York City bike sharing scheme that we've done recently. And I should say we are adding bike sharing as an active mode to the tool as well. So here we had trip data available for several years in New York, cycling trips, so general cycling. We're at 380,000 in 2013, then increased to 420,000 a year later. And we had these data all the way through 2019. We can also look at how many trips have been done by the bike sharing scheme and how those increased over the years. And then taking assumptions on how long these trips are or how fast cyclists travel. These are converted into minutes traveled per person or per cyclist and run through the tool. And in conclusion, we estimate that the bike sharing scheme in New York yields benefits in an order of magnitude of $80 million annually. How can you access the tool? I list here the main website, heatwalkingcycling.org, and the global prototype is available on this website. And if you want to go directly to the tool, you can use the lower URL. And I believe all these slides will be posted after this webinar. With that, I conclude my talk, and I'm happy to answer some questions if there are any. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. So, yeah, we've got 5 minutes for questions and answers. So please send them through the Zoom platform, but I'll start with a couple that we have already here. So one of the first questions is, how confident can you be in the data when working on a global model like this? And when might the uncertainties lead to the wrong answers?
I think it's important to distinguish the different types of data, and there are huge differences in the accuracy of that data. So in our experience, often the biggest challenge is to obtain the actual active travel data. And that is not data that the tool itself provides. That's a burden that we put on the user. And so that can be very challenging in many countries, and specifically in the global context. But the purpose of HEAT often is to provide kind of a first step into this discourse. And so it can also be, hypothetical scenarios. What would be if, cycling would be at this level at baseline, and we would maybe increase it by 50%. In terms of the mortality data, I think we're relatively confident that this is robust data, same for air pollution data, clearly of much lower quality, if available at all, are the crash risk data. That's a challenge even in countries with the best data available in the US or in Europe. Those are very, very difficult to come by.
Okay, so I do have a follow-up question on that. I would have actually thought that the crash data is of higher quality. Why are you saying that that's a particular low quality element?
Yes, so with crash data, it's important to distinguish basically what we call the numerator and the denominator. So that the number of accidents, of crashes, especially fatalities, that number is fairly reliable, or we should say very reliable. But to translate it into a risk estimate that we can use in these calculations, we need a crash rate per kilometers traveled. And this exposure number, so the denominator per how many kilometers this happened, that is usually the limiting factor. In many countries, we don't know how many kilometers of cycling or how many kilometers of walking actually led to this certain number of traffic fatalities.
Okay. So another question we have here is, what data and models are available or in development to estimate active mobility as part of public transit trips?
I think the best source for this would typically be a travel survey, household travel survey, like in a representative population, where typically 1 day of travel is captured completely. And then you would distinguish between trips going from A to B and stages within these trips. And typically these capture the stages where you walk from home to a transit station, and then you take transit. And then again, maybe you might walk the last stretch or bike a stretch to your final destination. So that's how you could get at the active travel data directly. I'm not aware of any models or, you know, conversion factors, if you want, that would just tell you, okay, per transit trip, there's like 10 minutes on each end of walking every time. I think it would be highly context dependent. And that's in general with heat, that we basically leave the active travel input side to the local users because it is so dependent on local context.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. And I think another thought I had listening to you. So right now it's only, the tool is only including mortality as a health outcome. Is there any plan to include morbidity outcomes in it?
Plans might be the wrong word. There's definitely an ongoing discussion about that since many years. And the main reason why we're not including it is to keep the tool simple. Tools like ITHIM do that, right? There is somewhat more complex. I think the main other reason is ITHIM does not monetize the impact. So I think calculating effects on morbidity nowadays is possible. There's a lot of good data out there, we know that. But if we promise the users that we would also monetize these impacts, it gets much more challenging. There is not a very straightforward or simple generalizable way to do this for all contexts. And it would certainly put, it would make the tool more complex. For the purpose of heat, it might not be as relevant. I think heat is not intended to be your one and only highly accurate assessment. I think it's often your first shot at it. You know, you can, as a new user, you can play around with heat for a few hours, and you should have some results in your hand that give you a clear indication whether you want to, you know, follow this discussion, want to take these numbers and involve other people, want to pursue this discourse. For a little bit more advanced users, you can get numbers out of this within half an hour. And so I think if you would conclude that you need a morbidity assessment as well, you would probably shift to something like ITHIM.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks very much, Thomas. We'll move on to our next presentation by Rachel Aldred on the propensity to cycle tool. Welcome, Rachel.
Great, thanks very much, Janine, and I'm really pleased to be part of this event. It's great, and I've been learning a lot. So hopefully you can see my slides now. I'm going to be talking about the propensity to cycle tool and methods for modelling cycling potential for research and for policy. So I'm going to highlight a few of the innovations and methods that we've developed, but also say a little bit about the policy implications. So what is the propensity to cycle tool? So the PCT is a tool for modelling, analysing and visualising cycling potential in areas and along routes. We're operating at pretty high levels of spatial detail. We're looking at small areas. We're looking at route networks and route segments. And the idea is to look at cycling potential in the future. Our main funder is the Department for Transport since 2015, and the tool covers England and Wales. It's freely available at pct.bike. Because of limits of time, I'm not going to be able to show you very much in the way of screenshots from the tool, but I encourage people, if you're not familiar with it, go and have a look at pct.bike, and it's all up there. It's freely available. You can download data, you can play with the interface, and the code is all open source and available at GitHub as well. We feel this is really important. We're an academic team at the universities of Cambridge, Leeds and Westminster, and we wanted the tool to be freely available to anyone who wanted to use it. The tool is recommended for use by the Department for Transport in England for local authorities in developing local cycling and walking infrastructure plans. So it's specifically strongly recommended in the technical guidance that they're given in terms of developing their plans for cycle networks. Now, given that Department for Transport allocates funding to authorities who put in bids for these things, you know, that's a strong encouragement to use it. Around about a year ago, we looked at organisations that were using the PCT in England and Wales. And we found that at that point, over 60 transport authorities were using the propensity to cycle tool. Although this was not spread evenly across the country, there was particularly high use in the southeast and less use in Wales and the northeast. Potentially some transport authorities really struggle with capacity for transport planning, and we're trying to look into ways to ensure that we can spread use of the PCT more widely, so providing free bespoke training for different areas and so on. You'll note that London on the left there is not using the PCT as heavily as some other areas. That's because London has its own transport authority, Transport for London, which provides tools, provides models for boroughs within London to use. But outside London, you know, the PCT is something potentially really important for them in terms of cycle planning for authorities. Why did we develop the PCT? Really, it was solving a problem in terms of the ability of authorities to plan for cycling. So cycling is pretty marginal in the UK. It's around 2% of trips. It used to be around 25%, but we had a catastrophic decline in cycling post-war. It's also highly skewed in terms of who cycles. So around 3/4 of bike trips are by men. And this is not a kind of ratio that you find in developed cycling countries like the Netherlands, like Denmark, where you get a lot of cycling. But it's kind of familiar in places that have low levels of cycling. But the problem then is cycling is marginal, it's often invisible, it's skewed and so on. And it's been really hard for authorities, even when they want to build cycling infrastructure, because you know, it's a difficult thing to do. It's not something that they've done in the past. It's not something that necessarily has had a strong constituency. So cycling infrastructure has often ended up being built where it's easy to build, where there's a bit of spare footway, a bit of space to put something in, not necessarily the best place to build. Or at best, where people currently cycle, where you currently might be able to see people cycling along a route. But many parts of the UK, you don't even really have that. And what we really need, we don't really need to look at present cycling to plan for the future. We want to look at what cycling might be like in the future. We want to look at cycling potential. But obviously you can't see cycling potential, you can only see current cycling. So the PCT is a way of visualising that cycling potential. If you like, it's a way of creating a predict and provide tool for cycling, in the same way that transport planning in the 1950s was described as doing predict and provide for the car. That there were very few people using cars at that time, and yet there was a vision of a future where many more people would use cars. And that's kind of what we need now for cycling in places like the UK. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the PCT methods, and as I mentioned, talk about a couple of innovations that we've developed recently. So the PCT, for this detailed level of spatial planning, route and area-based planning, we need origin destination data. We need data for as much of the population as we can get, so not a kind of sample survey, but actually for as many people as possible. So luckily in England and Wales, our census, which is only every 10 years, unfortunately, has origin destination data for commuting. And that's what we started off with. We've since added school travel. But for commuting, it's got everybody's home address and everybody's work address, and covers around about 94% of the population. People are legally obliged to complete it. So it's got this origin destination for millions of commuters, and it's disaggregated into all the main modes, which is really important. We don't just want cycling. We want to look at those trips that are not currently cycled in particular. We also have for each origin destination pair, route distance and hilliness, which we get from an algorithm called Cycle Streets, that's a cyclist journey planner. And that's really important because there might be a crow fly distance of 5 kilometres, but we don't fly like crows. We follow routes, and it might actually be a lot longer than 5 kilometres. Underlying what the PCT does is a model of current propensity to cycle as a function of distance and hilliness. So even in countries with an awful lot of cycling for any individual trip is strongly related both to distance and to hilliness. So that was our starting point. And you can see that for both, there is a curve. There's not a cutoff. So, we're doing something more sophisticated than saying, okay, we think trips under 10 kilometres could be shifted. We're applying these curves. We're applying versions of these curves and looking at which trips might most easily be switched to cycling as cycling grows. We started off doing this on an aggregate level in terms of small area OD pairs, and now we've moved to individual level modelling, which allows some quite exciting developments, which I'll come on to talk about in a bit. But there you can see that the observed likelihood of cycling to work and the modelled, fit pretty well for distance, a bit less well for route gradient, but that's harder to measure. We then model cycling uptake under different scenarios. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the different scenarios in a moment. So where do we think cycling would grow under these different scenarios of change? And we also estimate the health and carbon impacts as well. So a couple of our scenarios are relatively short-term, relatively unambitious. They're called government target. And we've got a government target for cycling to double by 2025 from 3%, and that would be from 3% of journeys to work to 6% in this case. So the first government target scenario is called government target equality, because it's only based on distance and hilliness. We're using the relationships shown here. So to sort of explain it simply, it's kind of like, forget about the cycling that already exists. Think about the origin destination pairs that are not currently cycled, all 97% of them. We're then applying those relationships to those trips and then creating another 3% of people cycling to work based on those equations, based on those curves. So cycling doubles, and the additional amount of cycling is based only on distance and hilliness. So those trips that are most likely to be shifted based on distance and hilliness are most likely to shift to cycling. However, we've also been able to develop more recently what we've called a government target near market scenario. So while the government target equality scenario doesn't take anything other than trip distance and hilliness into consideration, when we moved to individual level modelling, it opened up the possibility to do things a little bit differently. So we've got a synthetic population, which was mentioned earlier in a different talk, the use of synthetic populations. We've got a synthetic population of commuters, including a range of demographic and small area variables. And this enables this near market scenario, which came from the fact that although we know that if we're going to get a lot of cycling, if we're going to substantially increase cycling, it has to be more equitable. We thought that for a relatively small increase, it was plausible that it might increase more among people, the type of people who currently cycle. So hence the near market. We're in a bit of two minds about this scenario, because on the one hand, it maybe is more plausible in the near term. On the other hand, we worry about reproducing existing inequalities, which need to be reduced if we're going to get, a substantial increase in cycling. But basically, as government target equality and our other scenarios just depend on trip distance and hilliness, so they're blind to demographic factors, government target near market also throws in age, sex, car ownership, ethnicity, and several small area variables as well, deprivation, rurality and sparsity, and uses also the current associations of those with likelihood of cycling. So it incorporates trip distance and hilliness alongside demographic factors. And it produces some quite interesting results. Now that we're using individual level modelling, we can look in detail at the results of the scenarios. And here, this gives you an example. This is gender and take-up for these two scenarios. So as I mentioned, cycling is very gender unequal in the UK, in England and Wales. And on the left, you can see the baseline, 4.3% of men cycling to work, in itself pretty low, but only 1.8% or so of women. Now, under government target equality, what happens is that gap starts to close. It doesn't close completely because the existing cyclists are gender skewed, but the cycling take-up is not skewed in that way. And in fact, it's skewed towards women because women tend to make shorter commute trips, which are hence more cyclable. On the other hand, the government target near market scenario reproduces the inequalities, and there's a large gender gap in that scenario, unsurprisingly, because it reproduces the existing, it's biased by the existing demographic inequalities. So in this scenario, you get around 8.6% of men cycling to work and only 3.3% of women. We do have more ambitious scenarios. So I wanted to show you the cycling to work propensity curves for two other scenarios. So Go Dutch and e-bikes. So Go Dutch basically uses Dutch travel survey data to develop propensities by distance and gradient based on how Dutch commuters behave. And we've then applied that to English and Welsh commuters. And you can see that the curves are much higher, particularly at the shorter distance end than the baseline. The green curve is for e-bikes. So that takes Go Dutch, takes the Dutch distance and hilliness-based propensities, and it then adds in the assumption that people have access to e-bikes, which we're noticing in high cycling countries, increasingly e-bikes are used for longer and hillier trips. So for this scenario, we're using data from the Dutch travel survey on the use of e-bikes for longer trips and Swiss travel survey data for the use of e-bikes on hillier trips, because the Netherlands isn't hilly enough to get those to be able to derive those equations. And you can see some interesting things. So if you look at a 10-kilometre commute, which is around about the distance that I would go in normal times, you can see that under the Go Dutch scenario, just over 10% of people would cycle that. And under the e-bike scenario, you're seeing around a bit over 20%. So it makes quite a difference for those longer trips, and it makes quite a difference in hillier and more rural places as well. And we found that, for instance, Cornwall Council was very interested in this because they see the potential added value of e-bikes, if we can get mass cycling, the potential added value of e-bikes in an area that is very hilly, is very rural. I also wanted to say something about physical activity and hilliness, because again, this is something where the individual level modelling has helped. Now, coming after Thomas has been quite helpful because I'm not going to go through the health benefits of cycling from physical activity stuff, but basically that's the kind of thing that we're doing here. It's based on the Department for Transport's appraisal guidance, which in its turn is based on the HEAT approach. So we're looking at change in met hours per week based on a shift to cycling. We're also able to use individual age and gender and local authority mortality rates, which is quite helpful because, for instance, an authority that has relatively poor health because of deprivation, obesity, you will then be able to see that you'd get potentially higher health benefits. We also incorporate the negative impacts of a shift from walking to cycling, as well as lower per kilometre health benefits from e-bike use. So we're able to calculate what we think are the health impacts of e-bike use. E-bike trips, of course, are longer and hillier than traditional bike use, but per kilometre you'll get a lower benefit. And the individual level modelling allows disaggregated analysis, which is also interesting. So we can look at where the health benefits occur in terms of which groups. The users who shift from walking are likely to be younger, reducing the health cost, for instance. And just finally on the hilliness and the health benefits. So this is interesting. So hilly areas, as you've seen from the curves earlier, have lower cycling potential. People are less likely to cycle hilly trips. Therefore, they'll have a lower health benefit per 1,000 commuters. Now, initially, our calculation of health benefits was based only on distance, so per kilometre cycled, per kilometre of extra activity, cycling activity. And you can see on the right there that there's a gradient in terms of hilliness. So the least hilly areas there are getting 3 times the benefit in a given scenario compared to the hilliest areas. So this is interesting for thinking about investment and which areas you invest in. However, we've recently been able to calculate the additional health benefit of uptake in hillier areas and to adjust the curve based on hilliness. And this narrows the health impact gap between investing in hillier and less hilly areas. So now you see that comparing the hilliest to the least hilly quintiles, the difference is more like twice in terms of the least hilly areas having twice the health benefits rather than having 3 times. So this is something interesting and important for authorities to think about. So to summarise, hopefully I've managed to introduce the PCT as an evidence-based predict and provide tool for cycle network planning. It's recommended for use in England by the Department for Transport and Local Travel Planning, and a year ago it was in use across 60+ English local authorities. We've now got a sophisticated microsim model based on population origin destination data. I've talked a bit about the health and health economic impact calculations. And just finally, in terms of some of the other presentations that I've been hearing, this individual level modelling of health impacts seems like it fits quite well with new approaches to transport modelling. So thank you.
Haneen, you're muted.
Yeah, I just noticed, sorry. So I just said, thanks, Rachel. We've got a couple of minutes for a couple of questions. And I think you already touched on this by talking about how many local authorities have used the tool. But one of the questions we received is whether you know if the PCT has been actually used to develop active transportation policies or changes in planning.
Yes, I mean we did an initial review a year ago. We're now following that up because we think there's going to be more evidence. But authorities are using it, for instance, in network planning, in looking at where they think the corridors of greatest demand are going to be. They've also used it in terms of communicating policy positions, developing policy positions. So Cornwall, for instance, I mentioned that they were interested in e-bikes. So they communicated to the Department for Transport saying that they wanted to see greater subsidy, greater support for e-bikes. But yeah, we see route network planning and also planning of neighbourhood initiatives as being crucial, and we're seeing that happening.
Okay, that sounds very promising. And another question, and again, I think you touched on it a little bit, is about inequalities. So the role of things like age, gender, socioeconomic status in the tool. So maybe you can just elaborate a little bit on that.
Yes, I mean, the question of inequality is really important. It was one reason why, as I say, we just initially we were just looking at distance and hilliness. And when you look at the types of trips that people make, for instance, you do find that women and older people who are underrepresented in terms of cycling in the UK actually make relatively cyclable trips. So, you know, in a sense, they are the more natural cyclists in terms of their trips, but they're also strongly underrepresented. So we're able to look at that. It seems to me as well that it's quite important to look at benefits and outcomes as well. And with the individual level model, we can look at where the benefits accrue. And we can look at one thing that's quite interesting is the fact that cycling has multiple benefits, but different, depending on which benefits you prioritize, you might have different strategies. So in terms of reducing CO2 emissions, getting men to start cycling has more benefits because men are more likely to drive in the first place. On the other hand, for instance, if you were thinking about time savings, which isn't something we look at in the PCT, but has been looked at elsewhere, you know, potentially women's trips, which are currently often slower, women would get a relatively high benefit from switching to cycling. So it depends kind of which benefits we're thinking about. And obviously thinking about equity is really important when you consider the suppression of cycling that you see under among groups such as women in countries like the UK.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel.
Thanks.
We're gonna move on to keep on time, and I'm gonna hand it to Stefan Gusling to talk about why cost-benefit analysis could and should inspire transportation policy. Welcome.
Hi there. Hang on, I'll share my screen as soon as I get a chance. Right, here we go. Right, I'm going to talk a little bit about cost-benefit analysis, not something that comes easily to me, to be real honest, because there's some preconditions for using cost-benefit analysis that I find not always obvious. For instance, when it comes to transport, cost-benefit analysis, you would do things such as to value a human life that might be that might be lost because of a certain policy. And I find it difficult to put a value to human lives, to give you one example. And in other dimensions, it might be even more complex and more difficult to find the right value. So when we talk about cost-benefit analysis, there's generally two things that we need to do. One is to find the different parameters that we want to focus on. And then secondly, the cost that we want to associate with each of the items that we have chosen to include. Now, on the other hand, cost-benefit analysis is quite interesting because when you use it in transport context, I think there's some very interesting lessons that can be learned from recent applications. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. So first out, I think there's a general consensus, even among policymakers, that transport systems have to change because of climate change, because of noise, but also quite simply because there's not enough space to accommodate more cars on streets, and specifically in cities. I think that in cities, most conflicts that we now have are really about the car in comparison to all other transport modes. And then also probably a conflict that comes out of commuters entering the city while there's a totally different story going on within the city. So when we have the opportunity to use cost-benefit analysis to address the car in policies, that is quite interesting, because usually in city transitions, we have the problem that as soon as anything is done against the car, then you will have automobile lobbies that quickly spring up and will argue against these changes that as a transport policy planner, you may want to carry out. So it becomes all the more important to find the right arguments in changing cities and changing transport policies to motivate these changes, and to also convince others that these policies are the right ones to choose. So I think I want to discuss today how a CBA might be an argument, providing an argument for transport system change. This can probably be best illustrated on the basis of an example to start with. We here could talk a little bit about what has happened in Copenhagen, because the Danish capital did already back in 2009 quite an interesting project. They wanted to change their transport system, but there was a big question about the cost of changing. And a very important question was whether investments should go towards the car, because obviously car users were arguing that there was not enough space for them. So you could say build new parking areas or new roads in order to accommodate the car, or if you could perhaps choose a different route to resolve traffic conflicts. So the interesting thing about Copenhagen are two different things, really. I think the first was the decision to base their future planning on CBA, on cost-benefit analysis. And they also chose to do this in comparison of two different transport modes, because the usual process is that you will do this for one transport mode, mostly the car. You will then come to a decision as to whether or not an investment is justified. But in the case of Copenhagen, the decision was made to actually compare the car and the bicycle on a per kilometer basis. And then secondly, which I find equally important for transport planners, there was a decision being made that involved all political parties to support this process. So right from the start, you had the different political parties sitting around a round table to both discuss which kind of parameters should be involved in the cost-benefit analysis, and also how the cost for these parameters should be assigned. And that was very important, perhaps as important as the process itself, because after the project was carried out without anybody knowing the result, it was an agreement that all the political parties would have to adhere to whatever the outcome might be, and consequently engage in the changes that this study would suggest. So to very quickly recall the parameters included, the most important ones were just 5. The operating cost of a car or a bicycle, the time cost, which is a very disputed item because usually in time cost assessments, you will find that cyclists assign a lower value to time than motorists, which then becomes an issue of comparison. Should you really use this kind of value and accept that for a cyclist it might be more fun to ride a bike and hence less seen as a cost involved, or should you stick to an approach where time is essentially treated the same? In Denmark, people involved in this exercise chose to have different costs for time by bicyclists or motorists. There's an accident cost, there's air pollution, there are health effects, and the last are important as well, because as we all know, if you cycle, your mental and physical health will improve, you will have fewer sick leave days and so on. So there's pros and cons, benefits and costs that you can involve in this kind of methodology. And the outcome in Copenhagen was, if you look at both the social and the private cost, which is again an important distinction here, because when you calculate the cost of 1 kilometer of cycling in comparison to 1 kilometer of driving, you have 2 different types of cost. One is the social, the societal cost that is essentially borne by society, and then you have the private cost that is borne by the person engaging in traffic, the car user or the bicyclist. And if you compare both of them, the result is that for Copenhagen, the car would cost about 50 cents per passenger kilometer, that is divided by the number of people traveling in a car, and the bicycle would be 8 euro cents per passenger kilometer. So essentially it's six times cheaper to ride a bike than to drive a car. But more important for transport investments was the question of the social cost. In other words, how much it would cost society, or how much society would benefit if you invested in infrastructure that would make car driving or bicycling more easy. And here the result is quite telling. The car involves a cost to society, about 15 euro cents per passenger kilometer, and a bicycle involves a benefit for society, about the same, 16 cents per passenger kilometer. So in other words, in Copenhagen, the decision was made that for society, it would be much better to invest in infrastructure for the bicycle rather than the car, because the car would entail additional cost for society in the future, while the bicycle would entail a benefit for society. And they actually did translate this then into policy. So the planning outcome, then the political outcome was that they would invest 135 million euro in new bicycle highways, with an expected benefit of 980 million euro over time. And since this decision was made, Copenhagen invested about 40 euro per resident in a year, now over 10 years, in bicycle infrastructure. So this political decision on the basis of cost-benefit analysis actually led to tangible changes in the transport system in Copenhagen. The European Union is also using cost-benefit analysis for investment projects. This is the current document, and it essentially considers 7 different parameters: travel time, operations costs, private and commercial, and then accidents, noise, air pollution, and climate change. These are the parameters that will be looked at before any infrastructure investment decisions are made in the European Union. Back in 2018, we thought that this kind of view was probably not really comprehensive. There were too many parameters being left out of the calculation. And we then decided that we should look into the whole range of parameters that one should consider in this type of analysis, and not only just for the car, rather than also for cycling and walking, to have 2 alternative active transport means involved in the calculation process. So we first of all went through the literature, came up with 14 different parameters that we thought should be considered. Probably by today's standard, 2 years later, there's already a number I would like to add that is not even included in this list. But let's say if you just look into these 14 different parameters that also include aspects such as perceived safety and discomfort and other items that are of importance, then you'll get a very, very different picture of the total cost, in this case calculated for the European Union, because we wanted to have a big picture. Here is essentially the slide that tells you something about the calculation process, what was included, how it was included, how it was compared, and what the outcome is. The social cost here is called external, and you can see that we have calculated this for the 14 different parameters for the car, the bicycle, and walking. Obviously, the cost of many items is very, very small, calculated per kilometer. And then also you have question marks with a number of items that are just not calculable. The result is nevertheless that for the European Union, probably the cost of driving a car to society, that means all the taxes and fees and so on that a car driver is already paying are subtracted from this number, is about 10 to 11 cents per kilometer that somebody is driving. So that's quite a significant cost that is imposed on society, because the car is not bearing the full cost of what its externalities are to society, its negative externalities. Then the situation is quite the opposite for the bicycle. We here arrive at the conclusion that the benefit for society of somebody driving or riding a bicycle is about 18 cents per kilometer, while somebody walking even generates a benefit to society that's in the order of 37 cents per kilometer. So the conclusion here then is that if you use this type of comparative cost-benefit analysis, you might gain insights that are quite important, because in this case we could calculate that the annual cost of supporting the automobile system in the European Union is in the order of 500 billion. We can also confirm that walking and cycling are very beneficial to society. So wherever you can change transport mode choice, as in cities, cycling and walking should be supported. On the other hand, you should think about whether the car should not bear a higher share of its cost to society, for instance, by no longer forwarding subsidies to the car, such as free parking. And overall, I think there's a sound argument that could be made here for comparing transport mode alternatives, not just looking into the car, in other words, and to then use this as an argument for transforming transport systems that could start probably mostly in cities. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Stefan. And I think your last point is quite important, because usually when we talk about cost-benefit analysis and transportation investment appraisal, we're always more worried about the costs, while, you know, with active transportation schemes, the benefits outweigh the costs. So that's a very good point. We've got 5 minutes for questions, and the first one's from Mark. He's saying the car industry is arguing currently that it brings many benefits through employment. Is this something that's included in your models? And then he's saying car companies are asking for much money in the stimulus package. Do you think this is justified, or can it be better spent?
Well, we don't look into employment benefits or any secondary economic effects the different transport modes might have. I don't think that would be a good approach, because it will skew the results towards one direction. It's also not really scientifically straightforward. But what could be said is that obviously any transport mode generates benefits. You could also support the bicycle, the cycle industry, and get benefits out of that. So I think we should keep it straight and focused. And for the stimulus package, obviously the answer has to be no. The transport system, the car system is already a heavily subsidized industry, and we don't want to put more money into this industry. We want that the opposite happens. We want to support those transport modes that generate benefits for society.
Mm-hmm. And let me ask you a follow-up question on that. So the value of time, does that not consider employment in its estimates?
Oh, sorry. The value of time is just the time that people associate with driving in terms of a cost. For instance, if you sit in a car in a traffic jam in Los Angeles, then people perceive that as a cost. And this is the cost of time. And obviously, if you were a transport manager and building, say, a 15-lane road that would take everybody quicker to work, you could reduce the cost of that time. And that is usually what is considered in CBA for these kind of investments.
Okay. We have another question, which is how generalizable do you think the accident cost figures for biking in particular are? For Switzerland, they have been estimated to be much higher. Could you elaborate on the challenges of getting these right?
Well, accident figures obviously are difficult to assign. We have been using mostly the Danish figures that are quite advanced. I should believe that Switzerland has also very advanced figures. But one key challenge here is, for instance, the question as to who is responsible when it comes to accidents that involve both cyclists and cars, which is a major issue. You know that the Netherlands, I think I know, has introduced legislation where car drivers are the primarily responsible if it comes to an accident involving the two different transport modes. But how this should be done and what the ideal allocation would be, and also how accident cost figures should be calculated, because obviously the share that people already pay in terms of insurance fees is subtracted from this number. That definitely could be refined in the future.
Okay, I'll do just one more question before we move forward. So as far as I understood is that the European Union CBA kind of guidance does not include health right now. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And the paper you guys published on the other parameters that can be included, is this something that they're thinking about or that they're discussing right now? Is there an update or a revision that's planned?
I don't know. The current volume is obviously just valid until this year, so I'm pretty sure revision is ongoing. I would personally hope that greater emphasis is paid on, in particular, the health issue, and then obviously on an inclusion of different transport modes, because we know next to nothing about public transport, for instance, which also would be an important thing to include in this type of comparison. And then also we would want more comparative analysis for cities where you don't just look into one transport system item or transport mode, rather than where you look into a distribution of different options that would consider different ones.
I would hope so too. Well, thank you so much. We're gonna move on to our next speaker, Veronica Sanchez, and she'll be talking about a new model of sustainable mobility. Can public spaces change the way we move? Welcome, Veronica.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Veronica Sanchez, and I'm working in Barcelona City Council as an urban planning engineer. And in particular, I work for the public transport strategy in the city of Barcelona. So I'm going to talk about the Barcelona Mobility Plan, which, as you may know, the answer to can public space change the way we move? The answer is yes, of course. We can change the way the people move by changing public space. So I'm going to try to explain what actions have made Barcelona to change this mobility in the city. A few data. The 20th century model cities, which are shown in the picture, were based on private transit and leaving a few space or a few public space to pedestrians. But lucky us, we live in the 21st century model cities where public transport has a very important paper. Bikes and pedestrians have priority, and public space has a very important paper in the mobility. About population and vehicles. Barcelona is inside the metropolitan area of Barcelona, but as you can see, Barcelona has 100 square kilometers, and the metropolitan area has more or less six times the surface of Barcelona. But the density population in Barcelona, it's like 3 times the density of the metropolitan area. So we are one of the densest cities in Europe. Also, our total number of vehicles in Barcelona, more or less is 500,000 cars and more or less 300,000 motorbikes. And we also, the park, we divide the car park, we divide into the on-street car park and off-street car park. As you can see, the offer that in the offer of places off the street, it's higher than the on-street car park. But as you can see, in the on-street car park, we have most of 5,000 of these spots are also free parking. So it's something we want to revert because it's public space occupied by cars. What about our modal distribution? We have to differ between connection displacements and internal displacements. The connection displacements, which are about 2 million trips, we can see that half of them are made by public transport and half of them are made by private transit. But when we look at our internal displacements, which are about 5 million, this change a lot because more than a half are made in active mobility, which are by foot or by bike. 30% of these internal displacements are made in public transport, and 14% of these displacements are made in private transit. So the modal distribution inside Barcelona is quite good. And because this active mobility is so important in our modal distribution, that's why pedestrians and also bikes are one of our main targets when we plan to urbanize a new street or to make a new urban planning project. So what have we done? What points do Barcelona Mobility Plan attack? We have 4 main targets, which are based in safe mobility, sustainable mobility, equitable mobility, and efficiency mobility. We wanted to reduce number of accidents related to transit. We wanted also to facilitate modal shift towards more sustainable modes. We wanted to reduce air and noise pollution caused by traffic. We wanted to moderate traffic energy consumption and reduce its contribution to climate change. And we wanted to increase use of renewable and clean energies. We also wanted to encourage alternative uses of public road and to ensure accessibility to the mobility system. And we also, of course, wanted to increase transportation systems efficiency and also to incorporate new technologies to manage mobility. In this mobility plan, we have a modal hierarchy, which is based in these 5 modes. At the top of that, we have by foot mobility, which is based basically on pedestrians. In the second one, we have bicycle. The third one is public transport mobility. And then we get urban distribution of goods and private transport. So when we have a new urban planning project, we look to this modal hierarchy to be fulfilled. So we are not implementing any new strategy or any new change in the public space which doesn't fulfill this modal hierarchy. This is a summary of some actions that we have implemented in the Barcelona Mobility Plan, which are divided into the pedestrian actions. with some projects that we have implemented related to mobility to schools and pedestrians, some actions related to bikes, which were focused on encouraging the change to to sustainable mobility, to increase the bicycle network, or to regulate the use of bicycles in the city. Actions related to public transport, which basically was focused on increasing bus lanes and also to change the bus network. I will explain it later. And actions related to urban distribution of goods, related to efficient management of urban distribution and new technologies, and also for cars, for private transit. Some of the main actions, as you may know, focus on pedestrians, were superblocks, well, the implementation of superblocks in Barcelona. The superblocks model, what it does basically is to define a peripheral basic traffic network, and inside this peripheral network, we give the priority to pedestrians. So you can go inside this superblock with your own car if you are a neighbor of this street, but you cannot go or you cannot pass through this superblock. So you are forced to turn right or left, and you are forced to return to this basic traffic network. So in the traffic network, in the basic traffic network, you will find cars and public transport and also bike lanes, but inside the superblocks, the priority is 100% for pedestrians. So I'm going to show you some pictures of two superblocks that we have implemented in Barcelona. The first one was Poblenou, and one of the most recent was Sant Antoni. And you will see that the implementation of these two superblocks was quite different, because in the Poblenou superblock, we did with tactical urbanism based in low-cost actions. And in the Sant Antoni superblock, we have used civil works. So this is a typical picture of this Poblenou superblock, which is based basically by paint and planters. In the left pictures, you can see the before, and in the right picture, the after look when we implement this superblock. So as you can see, we remove a bike lane and also two car lanes and a service lanes, and we transform this street into a rest area to playground, and with some paint and some planters, we give this space to the citizens. The same street, we also remove the bike lane and we put some tables, and we recover this space for pedestrians and for a rest zone. These pictures are from Sant Antoni superblock. As you can see, they are very different from the Poblenou superblock. In this superblock, we use a civil work, so we transform the street with a very high income, well, high cost. The cost was very different from the Sant Antoni superblock than from the Poblenou superblock, but the idea was the same. We remove the car space and we give this space to the citizens. The same picture, the before and after. And this is an intersection of the two main streets of superblocks. And as you can see, the car can go through the superblock, and we force this car to turn right in this case. So the public space is 100% recovering for the citizens, and we give the priority to pedestrians. Some main actions about bikes. In 2013, we tackle almost 72% of the population with bike lanes. By 2018, we wanted to tackle the 95% of population. So this was our objective in the mobility plan. So all the actions that we have implemented to tackle this population was to increase the bike lanes and to improve the current bike network that we already have. About public transport, one of our main projects that we have implemented was we completely changed the bus network, and we convert the old bus network into a new orthogonal one, which was based into horizontal and vertical lines. So the users of public transport has a network more understandable than before. And we detected an increase in the users when we have started this project. So right now we have this orthogonal network, which is much understandable than before. About the achievements. As I explained, we have implemented 2 new superblocks and 3 pedestrian areas, and we detected a 4% increase in walking trips with these actions. In bikes, we increased at 20% the bike lanes, almost 126 kilometers. We increased also 17% on street bike parkings. And with these 2 main actions, we have detected a 31% increase in bike trips. And about public transport, with this change in the bus network and also increasing at 26% the bus lanes and also a 16% the metro lines length, we achieved an increase of 6% on public transport trips, which is a lot comparing from when we are in 2012. So in Barcelona, when we ask if public space can change the way we move, the question and the answer is yes, of course, we can change it. And we also change it with a participatory process from the citizens. So we think that if we implement a good policy and we define sustainable objectives, goods for our cities, we can change the way that people move into sustainable modes of transport. So thank you, that's all.
Okay, thanks very much, Veronica. We've got a couple of questions, and one of them is about Via Letana in Barcelona. Why is it so difficult to close off Via Letana for private cars? It does, you know, I've seen that street, and I have to say, I think making changes to that street would actually make a difference, and it also really messes up with the old city. So do you have any thoughts on that, or were there any discussions about that particular thoroughfare?
Yeah, Via Laietana is a street that for a long time ago has been discussing what street do we want, because it's a very important street for public transport. So the technical discussion is not if public transport should or not be in Via Laietana, but the thing is that we need to remove cars from Via Laietana. So I think that we all agree in that bikes and public transport should be in Via Laietana, but it's a street which is narrow in some. I mean, it's narrow because they have 2 directions, but it's narrow for the number of cars that we actually have in Via Laietana. So we wanted to change it. We wanted to wide sidewalks, because in Via Laietana we have a lot of cars, a lot of pedestrians, a lot of bikes. No, because it's not a street good for bikes, because it's plenty of cars always. So what we wanted to do is to remove car space, give this space for pedestrians and public transport, and also for bikes. But it's quite difficult because it's also a very important commercial zone. So we still need some spots for the distribution of goods. But we are working on that, because we need to do something in Via Laietana, and for sure that's the moment to do that.
Okay, that sounds promising. Yeah, I feel like it would be a very good kind of street or road to target, and probably it would make big changes if you can reduce the car traffic on that one. And I think kind of similar to that question is, you know, how did you manage to convince your council members to support these changes? And I think the super blocks in particular, because they're a bit more I'm not sure the word is radical, but a bit more unusual. Somebody's asking, was there any restrictions, and how did you manage to deal with that?
The thing is that for super blocks, we didn't need to convince council members because we are very aligned in this case with the political team. So I think that when you have the political team in accordance with you, it's very easy to implement projects. But we have some resistance in some cases for the citizens, because if you live in the super block, it's perfect. I mean, you remove the cars from your street, and you have sidewalks, you have priority if you are a pedestrian. But the thing is that we still need to do more actions and more than the super block, because what we cannot allow is to pass transit to the peripheral streets. So in some cases, we detect that inside the super blocks is fantastic, but when you look to the peripheral streets, the increase in transit is very, very high. So we are tackling these problems, maybe removing also space in the peripheral streets and giving this space to bus lanes, for example. So we want to reduce as much as possible the car space. But it's something that we have to implement with super blocks, because what we cannot do is to pass the problem to other streets. So the super block is a model that it actually works, but in some streets, for example, we are not implementing super blocks, and we are implementing what we call green street, which is having the super block model, giving the priority to pedestrian, but in the whole street, not in a super block. So it depends on the area you look, and the kind of mobility that you have it depends on the neighborhood. So you have to study quite good the mobility in the zone that you want to attack.
Yes, and a comment as well that I think is very relevant to this is whether you've considered the possibility of including transit infrastructure inside the super blocks, and how you think you can do that while maintaining the safety and accommodating for cyclists, pedestrians, and even child play, as you showed in those pictures.
This is one of the points that we are not getting the council member agreement for saying in a way. I mean, when you look into mobility, I think that we need a rapid transit inside super block. For bikes, for example, for me, it's necessary in some super blocks to put a bike lane, and I think it's completely safe, and you can give priority to pedestrians, and in some cases have also priority for bikes. I think it's necessary, and we have evidence that this is completely necessary in some cases. But the political team, it's not sure to implement that, because super block, the model, what says is that priorities for pedestrians. So if you put a rapid transit for public transport or for bike, pedestrians lost this priority. But it's something that we are studying. We want to analyze some cases where for the next super blocks we want to implement. We are analyzing cases when super blocks and bike or bus lanes can live together. We think it's necessary for sure.
Okay, and I know that there are 500 super blocks that have been proposed across the city. Can you maybe comment on whether this is something that might happen soon, and why isn't it under progress yet?
It's under progress. I mean, we have some super blocks that are more studied, so they are going to be implemented in the short term, but the super blocks model is something that if you see that the neighborhood of, I don't know, maybe if you live near Poplano and you see the super block of Poplano that works well and people is quite happy with that, maybe you are going to ask for a super block in your neighborhood. So it's something that it goes with the strategy of Barcelona. I think that people is starting to understand that cars should not be welcome. No, I mean that are more aware that cars has a lot of public space, and they are realizing that. So I think that it's good that people demand super blocks, and it's good that people demand also more bike lanes and more space for pedestrians, because it means that they are realizing the problem that the public space is conquered or was conquered by cars. So it's time to change that.
Mm-hmm. And I think that there are also very important health benefits to that model. ISGlobal recently published a paper showing that the implementation of the blocks across the whole city would prevent 700 deaths a year. So that message might be a good message to communicate to the public to kind of gain more acceptance and support for that model, other than the fact that it's actually nicer to have those blocks looking like they would in a super block rather than what they do right now. And then we've got another question of Mark. I know he's very invested in these super blocks. So he's saying, should we not have a network of Ramblas? Ramblas are nice.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Ramblas. It's another street of Barcelona that we want to change in some way, because in this street we also have a huge density of tourists. So yeah, I mean, I think that Ramblas and Via Laietana, which are like two main streets in Barcelona, I think that if we encourage the city members to change the streets and we change them and they work, I think that we can change any street in Barcelona if we change Via Laietana and Las Ramblas. But the thing is that we have to study in a good way the mobility, because, for example, in Las Ramblas and Via Laietana, as I said, we have an important problem with distribution of goods, because the streets in this area of Barcelona are narrow, except this one. And it's difficult to find public space close to Via Laietana or Las Ramblas. But, well, I think it has to be studied and try to find the perfect solution.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's a relatively new kind of application of this model. So there's definitely a lot of lessons to be learned.
Yeah.
But it's very promising that it's actually happening. And I think we're all looking at it as a really good example of what public space can look like. And it's nice that you guys are also tracking the changes in public transit and cycling and walking. And it would be nice if there are certain health or well-being elements as well that are being tracked as part of that as well. In some sense, I know that's much more complicated, but I think it can make the case for interventions like that even more strongly. So that's just something to think about. We do have one, I think, important question again about the super blocks, which is about how you're dealing with equity. So the question is, are you focusing initially on more deprived areas, or are the more affluent areas more likely to get the super blocks to start with?
It depends. I mean, there are super blocks that come from the participatory process, which are a neighborhood demand, and we study this demand, and maybe we think it was a good idea to implement it or not. And more than if it is a deprived area or not, what we look at is if there is the transit intensity. I mean, we cannot put, or at least not at that time, or not currently, we cannot put a super block in a main street of Barcelona, when, I mean, like Aragó Street, which is like the car street in Barcelona, where the connection in transit is very important. but maybe we can tackle another zones, and in maybe, I don't know, 10 years, the transit in Barcelona decreased, and we can implement another superblocks in different areas. But what we look at is we first define our basic transit network, and then we tackle the streets that are out of this transit network. And then we study how it works. But there are some streets in Barcelona that we need for cars, we need for mobility, because the mobility is a need for everyone, and we cannot remove the mobility in Barcelona. So we define some streets where the mobility is essential, because it's like a connection street. But removing these streets, we can act. We can implement a super block or rethink the public space in the other streets. But I think that the super block is a very equity project. I mean, you are giving a space to pedestrians, and you also are changing the street in a high way. So I think if you look at the pictures, the before and after are impressive. So the equity is an evidence. I mean, you are giving the space to cyclists, you are giving the space to childhood. You are giving the space for men and for women. So I think it's quite equity for everyone.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Veronica. I think we're about near time to finish. Personally, my impression from this session was that we really have made a lot of progress in terms of, models and tools to show what transportation impacts on walking, cycling, and health are. I think the question is, how can we actually incorporate these things in transportation investment appraisal and make it more a routine process? Because right now, none of it is mandatory, and that really limits the capacity of these advances to make a real world difference. So it's something I think for all of us to think about. I just want to end by thanking you all for staying and for attending the seminars, and thanking Mark, James, and Laura for their organization. I know it's been a lot of work. If you don't mind, there's going to be a satisfaction survey that will appear on your screen at the end of the Zoom webinar. And we'd really appreciate if you can take this survey and give us your opinion. So with that, I'll close and thank everyone and hope you all have a good day, good night, wherever you are. Thank you so much.